To what extent did you integrate fiction into the story or the narrative of the
Okay.
story,
Yeah.
which is inspired by your granduncle?
Yeah, okay, very good question. So, as I told you earlier, what I chose to do was to use the kind of storytelling part of my writing as a way to convey the history. So, the book is really what I would call faction, in that it is almost all factual. But, like, for example, that passage that I read for you, that's fictional. I've dramatized it, and as a way to actually tell the story. In the back of the book, there's a section called Author's Notes, where I have clearly told you where I have departed from the actual facts and why. And one or two characters that I've introduced, which were fictional, I've told you who they were. So it's really, I've used fiction as a way to convey actual facts.
Your lovely faces and lovely smiles that I'm sure you're having a great time. But there's a huge program ahead of us. There's going to be a music program as well. And there's so many beautiful topics. Amardeep Singh sir is here. His session is going to be great. And I wish for everyone to be here to just educate themselves and learn more and more today. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our moderator of the, what's the time? Afternoon? Yeah, the afternoon. So she's an engineer. She's an MBA. But her true love and identity lies in her words and thoughts. She's a voracious reader, prolific writer, and she's Sushma Saxena. She comes across as a professional who lives literature with the emotions and fervor of such of a religion. She writes both in Hindi and English with equal elan, with her school and engineering college days replete with rewards in creative writing, debates, elocutions, and poetry, both in Hindi and English. She's a very avid reviewer too, and she has written more than 100 articles in her book journeys series on social media. She runs 2 blogs. Now, these blogs are her heart-to-heart communication with young audiences, addressing their aspirations and anxieties based on the foundation of values. Her interest in reading has recently made her name featured in 3 books in different ways by authors acknowledging her contribution to their writing and in blurbs. So that's Sushma Saxena, everybody. Let's have a huge round of applause. So moving ahead, I would like to introduce our author of the evening, one of the authors. So he is Vijay Balan. Vijay Balan is an author, Indian author, who was born in India and later moved to the US for further studies. His novel, The Swaraj Spy, was inspired by the stories of his father, and his father told him about his granduncle, who, after being dismissed as a foot soldier for refusing to quell peaceful protests, joined a spy school to do his part in ridding India of colonial rule. Vijay found his father's story extraordinary as a child, and years later, he decided that these stories deserve to be told. And so we have him here. This book is the result of over a decade of effort and hundreds of hours of research, which led him to different corners of the world to ensure an authentic portrayal of the facts that gave this book life. Let's have a huge round of applause for Vijay sir. So last but not the least, Nikhil, Benegal. Nikhil has over 33 years of experience in global multinationals in leadership and management development and in operational roles. He has been a successful leader and manager developer for over 25 years in FMCG, manufacturing, agronomic, and other industries, both in the capacity of corporate roles and briefly as a consultant. His corporate career of 33 years was in 2 large MNCs, Hindustan Unilever and Coats PLC. Today, as a master certified coach from International Coaching Federation and a certified systemic team coaching practitioner and emotional counselor, he spends his time with executive and leadership coaching and leadership behavior assessments. Apart from the pro bono work that was focused on life coaching and other similar attempts to contribute. He lives in Bengaluru with his wife Indira. And so we have all of them today here, and with a huge round of applause, let's welcome them to the stage, everybody.
Hello, good afternoon. Wonderful being here, wonderful being in your company, and wonderful being in company of Vijay and Nikhil. No point repeating that this is an audience of book lovers. Book lovers have a different glow, and that glow combines to make a galaxy in this room. The room is lighted up. I am a reader. I am a bookworm. I am an avid reader. I am a bad reader because most of the people around me complain about I always having a book to read and not wanting to do anything else. So I'm also keen to hear from our authors as much as you are. And so I'll start right away. Authors have already been introduced. Here is Mr. Vijay, here is Mr. Nikhil. Mr. Vijay has written this book, The Swaraj Spy, and Nikhil is here with a proud creation. His father's Air Commodore, Mr. Ramesh Benegal's book. He'll be talking about that. And starting with Vijay, I will ask Vijay. I could give a background of INA and Burma and Far East and all those things, but I think I will let Vijay speak about that. Vijay, can you tell us about the big 500-page book you have written? What is it about?
Thank you. Can you all hear me in the back? Okay, terrific. Before I answer your question, I'd like to first thank VLF. I'd like to thank Jeetu Nayak and Sachin Jairadar for inviting me here and allowing me to share my work with all of you. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here. So what is my book all about? So, you know, the conventional wisdom is that you never answer a question with a question, but I'm going to do it. So I'm going to ask you if you can name the first leader of the INA. And I'm going to bet that 99.9% of you will say, of course, it's Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. And you'd be wrong, because the INA was founded by a man called Captain Mohan Singh of the Punjab Regiment. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is that my book covers some really very little known history, right? So the fact is there was an INA before the one that most people know about. And that INA collapsed because of tensions between the Japanese and the Indians. And as we go forward, I'll explain why that happened. So with that as context, the book is actually about my granduncle, my dad's mother's brother, who was with a paramilitary organization in India. And when a group of people were protesting against the hanging of Bhagat Singh in 1931, he was ordered to disperse that crowd. This was in Madras, today's Chennai, right on the beach. So when he got up to the crowd, he found that the protesters were all women, so he refused to follow the order. So they threw him out of the Malabar Special Police, is what it was called. Tried his hands at business, the Great Depression came, destroyed his business. So he moved to Singapore for a better life for him and his wife. This was before the war. Clearly he didn't anticipate the war. So he goes to Singapore and he's beginning to make a life. World War II explodes. The Japanese come very quickly down the Malayan Peninsula and take Singapore. While he was in Singapore, he comes in contact with a few people who later founded something called the Indian Independence League, which was the political wing of the INA. So because of that, those meetings, he then joins a secret spy school that was set up in Penang. It was called the Indian Swaraj Institute. 34 men were trained in that school. They were trained in espionage techniques, pursuit evasion codes, you name it. So, and he was both a cadet and an instructor in that school. And when 20 cadets from that school, out of the 34, 20 cadets were sent to India by the Japanese before they were ready, without telling the Indians, and possibly captured because they were getting feedback saying, hey, something has happened to these people, because of a double agent who was telling the British what was going on. my granduncle was sent on a rescue mission to say, what happened to these 20 people? And by the way, one of the reasons that that first INA collapsed was this, because the Indians said, come on, if we're partners, we're partners. You cannot do something and not tell us. Anyway, so my granduncle was sent on this mission, journeys through the jungles of Burma, kind of in a hall of mirrors. He doesn't know whom to trust, because anybody could be a double agent. So this book is about what happened to him and all the twists and turns of the world of espionage. And it's also about his wife, who's patiently waiting for him back in Calicut, not knowing whether this man is alive or dead. So that really is kind of a quick snapshot of what my book is all about.
Thank you, Vijay. You have put it really briefly, a 500-page, 500 interesting pages, intriguing pages. And that brings me to my next question. I found that the book is an education in itself. Geography of a very huge area, the culture, going to the details of even marriage traditions, rituals, food, dress, business, the history of Malabar. So how did you manage to do such a huge research?
Okay, that's a great question. So the seeds of the story were planted in my head by my father when I was a little boy. He would tell me about my granduncle. And those seeds were kind of rattling around my head for a long time. And then one day, I was actually in the shower and I suddenly had an epiphany saying, wow, this is a story that must be told. So I said, fine, let me find out what there is. I went to the web. There was nothing. The trail was not only cold, it was frozen. There was permafrost on it. So I said, okay, now let me see what I can do. I live in the US. I live in Atlanta in the United States. I made several trips to India, and I started with family. And the family told me a few things about him. But when you research family, you've got to be careful because there is a risk of this, mythologizing this person. There's a risk that it could become a hagiography. So I had to cross-check sources to kind of, figure out what is real and what may not have been real. But that only told me about his life before he left for Singapore. And that part took a lot more digging. I made many more visits, networked. One person led me to another, including, by the way, I was able to talk to one of the 34 people who was trained with this man. It was a fascinating conversation. Then I got my hands on letters that he had written. He smuggled letters out of a certain place he was in to get around censors, and those letters were preserved by one of his brothers, and they made incredible reading. It allowed me to get into his head. It allowed me to understand what he was going through as a person. And then I was also able to get my hands on British records of that time, and that took a lot of effort. One thing about the Brits, they wrote everything down, except the things they didn't want you to know. Those things they didn't write down. So slowly the story kind of emerged out of the mist. But it was like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, an old jigsaw puzzle where many of the pieces were missing. And the story that emerged out of the fog, if you will, was way more interesting than the little bits and pieces my dad had told me.
Thank you, Vijay. The story makes great sense and the continuity is never broken. Where is the beautiful girl who was anchoring? Where is she? I'm looking for her just to know. I have read both the books and we can talk a lot about that. I just wanted to know if she will tell us. We are running out of time. Okay, thank you. The book has a very intriguing title too, The Swaraj Spy. Can you tell us why did you name this book?
Okay,
The Swaraj Spy, without telling us the ending. I want the readers to see the ending for themselves.
Sure. Swaraj, as you know, I don't need to explain this to an Indian audience, it means self-rule. And that it was a slogan during the freedom movement. To it, the great Lokmanya Tilak said, Swaraj is my birthright and I shall have it. That's one reason. Second reason This spy school in Penang, where he was trained, and him and 33 others, it was called the Indian Swaraj Institute. That's the second reason. The third reason is, remember I mentioned the letters that kind of helped me get into his head? What I found was that he was changing as a person from kind of a gung-ho officer. If you told him to go take that hill, he would take that hill and 3 hills behind it, to someone who's kind of pretty contemplative and reflective about the human condition. So the third reason is that as the book progresses, he finds his own Swaraj. He finds his own self-rule of a very different kind. So those are the 3 reasons why I chose to name the book The Swaraj Spy.
Your writing style, Vijay, your writing style is very visual. There are so many beautiful images. You can almost see the book. While talking to you, I told you I was traveling with you. I was growing with you. The style is, I would put it like it's a cinematic style. So did you choose it consciously?
Very
Tell
much
us about
so,
that.
very much so, because it's not just in India or the US, I think the world over, school systems have done a disservice in the way they teach history. They make it boring and it's rote memorization and so on. And at the end of the day, to me, history is his story or her story. It's our story. So I chose a storytelling vehicle basically to convey all of this researched fact. And I tend to be a visual individual. I like photography, I like beautiful places and so on, and that's kind of reflected in my writing. So what I believe is that as a writer, if I'm going to take you to a different time and place, I need to take you there. I need to have you see. I need to have you hear. I need to have you even smell what my characters are experiencing, so you are immersed in that experience. And one of my readers actually called me later and said, it's only after I read the book and put it away I realized I'd learned a lot of history. So that was the objective. But having said that, on the many visits that I made, I made those visits to gather information for research, but also to get a visual cue of what these places looked like, so that then I could then turn around and describe it. India was pretty straightforward. I was able to go to those places and see, and I grew up in India, so I had a personal reference. But going to modern day Singapore doesn't help because it's all steel and glass. The old Singapore of wartime is gone. So if you put together the number of hours that I actually spent on YouTube looking at old videos of wartime Singapore, what does an air raid sound like anyway? That would be many, many hours. Burma was another interesting challenge. Burma has not changed, especially the parts of Burma where that my book is set in, which is close to the border with Mizoram in India. In those days, it was called the Lushai Hills. But it's way too dangerous to travel there. So what I did was, again, use technology. I knew where this man had gone based on all of the research I had done. I was able to sit in my study in Atlanta and use Google Earth and zoom right down to the places where he had been to and get a visual cue. But coming back to your question, Sushma, absolutely, it was a very deliberate choice because the audience that I have in mind for the book is anyone who likes a story, not necessarily a scholar or a history expert and so on. And the purpose behind my using this style is to make it as easy for you to connect with the story and the people in it.
Stated beautifully, Vijay, and this answer brings me to my next question. As you said, you delved into history a lot. You unearthed many things, many pieces of information. And as you had mentioned, that part of INA, many of us are not aware. We mostly know INA through Netaji's mention. You have gone into history, but I find that this is a very human story too. How did you balance these two aspects?
Okay, yeah, that's an important point. I refer to the letters. I refer to the fact that I saw him change during the course of those letters. So what I chose to do was not only talk about the history itself, but also about how history affects people. So at the end of the day, this is really a story about how world events that are way beyond their control, like the Great Depression, World War II, Quit India, the freedom movement, these are massive tectonic shifts that are going on. How do they actually affect two people? Kumar Nair, who is my granduncle, and his wife Malu. And how did they choose to navigate all of this in their own unique ways? So I often tell people that my book is actually an intersection of three journeys. One is Kumar's physical journey from Kerala to Madras to Singapore to Penang to the spy school to Rangoon through a safe house and through the pagodas and jungles of Burma back to India in a big circle. The second is his own personal journey of transformation. And I could clearly see it in his letters as to how he had changed, how the savagery of war and all of the double dealing, what does it do to a person's mind anyway? And the third journey is the backdrop. It is India's own tumultuous, tortured march to independence. So that's what I've tried to do. So in terms of the balance, while the intrigue and the adventure and the action is kind of in the foreground, the threads that tie it together in the background are the story of the transformation, and then the foundational part, which is the story of India's own journey.
That's a beautiful way, but not an easy way of balancing. Anyone sitting here from Kerala, or someone who has traveled to Kerala or has some idea of Kerala landscape? Anyone? You must have read the book also, so that question becomes redundant for you. I just wanted to know, some of the students are also sitting here. Just a question, has any one of you heard about Mr. T.P. Kumaran Nair? T.P. Kumaran Nair. Does the name strike a chord?
I'm not surprised. Actually, there is a road named after him in Calicut, his hometown, T.P. Kumaran Nair Road. I've spoken to people who live on that road, and they have no clue why that road is named after this man. So that's what happens with history, right? People get forgotten.
Yes, and that's what happens when no one writes a book.
One of the purposes in my writing the book is really, it's my own very, very humble, in a very limited way. I'm paying homage to this man.
Some of you are great readers, and some of you will turn out to become great writers, because readers become writers. So if something like this intrigues you, invites your mind to think about it, please do write. Mr. Vijay, tell us about the segment of history in which Mr. T.P. Kumaran Nair's story is set.
Okay, so those were very tumultuous times, and I will kind of just take you very quickly through the 1930s and the early 1940s. I mean, take a look at what was going on. Germany was rearming. Hitler had come into power. Fascism was in its ascendancy in Italy as well. So there was a massive shift to kind of an authoritarian nationalist set of regimes in Europe. You shift all the way to the other end of the world, to Japan. In fact, in my book, I talk about, I have a character actually say this, Japan and England are very similar because they're both resource-starved island states hanging on the ends of big continents. So when you're in a situation like that, what do? You go out and grab it. It's just that the British started earlier. They started 300 years earlier. And the British also had an incredible talent in putting a beautiful veneer around it and basically disguising colonial conquest as something they did for the good of the colonized people. The Japanese, on the other hand, kind of used a blunt instrument. So in 1933, Japan invades China. They create a puppet state, Manchukuo. The Americans put trade sanctions, and so the world is kind of just going headlong into catastrophe. It is almost like watching a slow motion movie of a train wreck. In India, you have a series of non-cooperation movements and a couple of roundtable conferences that didn't go anywhere, but you have this undercurrent that's boiling, a slow boil, which had kind of activated and energized the people to the concept of Swaraj, to independence. So that is the era in which this story is set. So in many ways, the ground had been prepared. It was dry ground, and all it took was a spark, and it lit a fire that consumed the whole world.
Vijay, one thing was very revealing and very fascinating to me when I found that people in those days were shouting slogans for India. The story, initial story is set in Malabar and Madras, and they were not shouting slogans for Malabar or Madras. They were shouting slogans for India.
Yeah, so that whole concept of an Indian national identity it is relatively recent. I mean, I would say post mid 1850s. Prior to that, people identified themselves with the individual empires, right? So, and I would argue that the concept of Indian national identity is still a work in progress. But what had happened by then is then, because of all of these freedom movements, but what had happened by then, by the 1930s, is that this whole concept of an Indian identity had already been forged, right? So people who were agitating, they were agitating for Swaraj for India, not for the Madras presidency or Malabar or the United Provinces or whatever. So that was a huge change from what had happened even 50 to 100 years ago. For a case in point, you take the 1857 uprising. The army that rose in revolt was the Bengal army. The British brought the Bombay armies and the Madras armies and the Sikhs and the Pashtuns to put it down. Now, the second time around, if something like that were to happen, they may not have been able to do it, because by then an Indian national consciousness had been forged.
I think we haven't have our fill yet, but still we have to share time among ourselves. So before audience asks their question, can I request you to read a passage from your book?
Sure. Okay, let me just set this up for you. This is the hero of the book, Kumar Nair, evacuating his sister and her two children from Singapore, and he's accompanied by his two brother-in-laws. Okay. On the day of their departure, Tangam, which is his sister, Tangam, Sulu, and Suku climbed into an RAF truck. Kumar drove while AM and Gopal sat in the back along with two suitcases. As they neared the harbor, cars and vans jostled horse carts and rickshaws laden with people carrying large bundles. Drivers leaned heavily on their horns as if sound could part the traffic. A huge throng pushed and elbowed its way from a sea of abandoned vehicles to the docks. The Keppel docks in Singapore, a source of British pride, had controlled commerce between the Far East and the Indian Ocean. But the round-the-clock bombing had reduced hubris to rubble. Roofless warehouses now gaped at the sky. A dockside crane lay sprawled on its side, its legs twisted in grotesque angles like a giant squashed insect. The funnels of a sunken steamer rose out of the water like pillars supporting dark clouds of smoldering ash that asphyxiated everyone's lungs. Kumar, AM, and Gopal linked arms to form a protective ring around Tangam and the children. They shuffled slowly as the crowd carried them forward. It took all their strength to keep the shield intact. Yells and cries in many languages tore through the air. Sulu gripped a suitcase with one hand and wrapped the other arm tightly around her mother. Tangam tightly held the precious boarding permits and the second suitcase in one hand and clutched onto Suku with the other. They reached a gate beyond which armed soldiers allowed only passengers to pass. Policemen desperately tried to control the crowd. Kumar steered the group towards Royal Navy officers checking boarding permits. A swarm of hands waving pieces of paper besieged the four harried officers. Checking permits against identification was impossible. The officers looked at permits and yelled instructions to the gate sentries about the number of passengers. 2, 4, 3. AM let Kumar's hand to get the papers from Tangam. He thrust the sweat-soaked permits at a sub-lieutenant. A torn epaulette bearing his rank insignia dangled from his shoulder. 3, he yelled, and AM stuffed the papers back in Tangam's hand as she moved forward with the children. The soldier glanced at the papers and grunted, "Ship number 4, over there." He pointed at a ship anchored 100 yards away. The ship's name had been hastily painted over in black. The crowd pulled in different directions towards 2 ships. Tangam kept her eye on the ship's funnel and dragged the children with all her strength towards the vessel. Her carefully pulled tight bun came loose, and wavy hair twisted crazily about her shoulders. They were halfway to the ship when air raid sirens went off. The crowd surged forward as one mass, jammed together with no room to take cover. Bombers appeared over the harbor in 2 giant Vs. Anti-aircraft guns let out deafening bangs. A shudder ran through the crowd at first as frightened screams rang from all directions. After the first few shells, they ignored the guns and pushed relentlessly towards the ships. The bombs fell like hail. Tangam prayed that her ship would not be struck. A few bombs fell on warehouses, but they spared steamer number 4. The stench of burning petrol descended like a toxic cloud. The crush pinned Sulu's arms to her side like epoxy. She could not lift her arms to protect her face. Tangam willed herself to push through to the gangway that was only yards away. "It's close now. Stay close to me. Come on." A little Chinese girl, just a few feet from Tangam, suddenly lost her grip on her mother's hand. She quickly disappeared into the crowd. The panic-stricken mother screamed for help. Tangam caught the woman's haunted eyes. There was nothing she could do to help. The horde carried Tangam and the children away from the unfortunate woman. She thrust her boarding papers at an officer at the foot of the gangway. He waved her on without looking at the permits.
Splendid, splendid. And so, yes, you can continue. Don't restrict yourself. I know.
Thank you. Thank you.
And so, what do we do now? I'll switch to Nikhil. We will have conversation with Nikhil.
Yes,
and
yes,
then
you
we
can.
will open the floor for the audience to ask questions. Okay. So, Nikhil, I start immediately without wasting any time. I know we are proud to read this book. This is a true story. This is absolutely non-fiction. And you being Air Commodore Ramesh Benegal's son, you must be prouder. So what is your connect with the book? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so my father had written this book. In fact, we got him to write this book really based on our experience, that's my sister and myself, right from our childhood. Because this book is about his experiences as a teenager, when he was born and brought up in Burma, in Rangoon. And it was at the time of the Japanese occupation, and then subsequently, the INA, revived by Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, moves its office from Singapore to Rangoon. And then his story, it's called Burma to Japan, which suggests what happened. He was selected as a Tokyo cadet. So my connect with this really has been listening to those stories that typically happens in a way, life lessons from each of his experiences whenever it came up. He would say, this is what happened when I was in, Manila, or the ship that I was traveling on was torpedoed and we were in the water for 4.5 hours. So, each time that kind of story that came out would in some ways, of course, be entertaining, but at the same time also be a life lesson. So, as it happened, my friends came to know about it, my sister's friends came to know about it. They still talk about it today, just this. And he was a very good storyteller. Yeah. So he would, have an audience. He loved telling a story. And it was these experiences. Of course, he later on went to be a very highly decorated officer in the Indian Air Force. That's a different part of his life. But it was these stories that, we persuaded him, now you're retired, why don't you write it? And he pulled out his old Remington typewriter. He loved typing away on it. So, yeah, it was from those times. And that's how that manuscript.
Anyone seen Remington typewriters? Oh, that was an art. Okay, Nikhil, as it is always said, truth is always stranger than fiction. It is more thrilling too. I'm bringing you to a few questions which are never asked. So tell us, what were young Ramesh's views about the bombing which was done in 2 places in Japan?
Yeah, so
he was in very close proximity to that
right.
place when it happened.
That's right. So at that time, that is 6th August 1945, he was in Tokyo, fortunately, otherwise I wouldn't be here telling that story. And what happened was, of course, they really came to know the details later, but they knew that something is, terrible has happened because, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. And it was without any real warning. Yeah. And it was aimed at, of course, while there were air raids, attacking non-combatants, children, school-going children, that kind of thing, women, people going about their work, even earlier. And they had got used to these air raid, the siren goes off, you go hide in the bunker and things like that. Of course, my dad at that point was in the the Imperial Japanese Military Academy as a cadet. When this happened, they heard that, a terrible bomb had gone off. And his views subsequently, because he did a bit of research, quite a bit of research on different perspectives, say a neutral perspective even coming from Western researchers, and of course the Japanese themselves. Like one thing sticks out, he said that the devastation was so enormous, unbelievable, unimaginable. Like a priest, Japanese priest says, the dead were the luckier ones. Because in Hiroshima, over 180,000 died and many maimed for life, several generations affected. And another 40,000, as the statistics suggest, in Nagasaki. But his view was that it was not really required. If one wanted to force unconditional surrender on Japan, there were other ways, because Japan, in many ways, by 1945, was losing the war. The industrial production which supported the war effort was, had come down to about half of what it was the previous year. And his view was, he was after all in the military, so his view was strategically, if they just focused on the merchant shipping and the railways and, made that unserviceable, there was a very good chance that Japan would have eventually surrendered.
Thanks for this very authentic description. And in contrast, what were Ramesh's view on Japanese military training, discipline? Especially, I would like you to tell the audience about kamikaze.
Right.
Is that the way it is pronounced, kamikaze?
Yeah, kamikaze. Yeah. So it's really, his impression right from when the Japanese occupied Rangoon, and they were actually trying to run away, not run away, exodus as they call it, the Indians in Rangoon. And despite their efforts, particularly my dad and his older brother and cousins, the Japanese overtook that place. So who were those people? Yeah, those were really the frontline army, Japanese army, and they were really, by nature, obviously rough and ready and very abrasive and rude, and they would push and slap people around. And in fact, they were, one thing that stands out was they had a vigilance police kind of, internal police force which looked after their discipline, the Japanese army discipline, as well as even the locals. And the way they did things was very harsh. Like, when they come back to Rangoon, they see 4 severed heads. They were the looters who had been punished exemplary, immediate, harsh. There's a story of, a senior officer of the Japanese army seen with a couple of, sex workers, and a junior corporal stops the car and harangues him in Japanese, and then slaps him left and right, and then the officer just salutes him, and he goes back into the car. That was accepted even by a person of senior rank, which he said, his experience in all these years of being in the military, he had never seen anywhere else. When he went into Japan, they were so refined, the mainland Japan, very polite, very refined. So there was a huge contrast. In terms of kamikaze, which you mentioned, it was something, I guess it was, it was to some degree religion related, because the emperor was like a god, and he had he had said that, okay, this war we are going to fight, and as Vijay was mentioning, that they had expansionist ambitions, but the thing was they were willing to, when they found, because American US air superiority was almost 100% closer to the time of 1944, 1945. And they were also pretty, huge in their fleets of the Navy. So the impact on the Japanese Army and Air Force was very, very, very stressful, very damaging. And that's when, this thing about, I think they have in their culture also, harakiri, right, which also happened after the surrender. They said that instead of, just going there, losing our aircraft and not being able to do much damage, let's do what, literally just go in there. So there was a very senior Japanese officer, a pilot, who went in and just flew his aeroplane into a ship and did a lot of damage. So the mentality part, it was not unlike, okay, we hear of, suicide kind of thing, fighters, militants, terrorists, whatever you want to call it. But he spoke to, he got an opportunity, because they were quite in awe of this, why would people go and kill themselves so voluntarily? He said they were highly motivated right till the last day. Their families supported them. And, 2 days before they're given that period, you can do anything you want and that sort of thing. And they isolate themselves with their family. And then, so, okay, that's one part. But the amazing thing was once, the surrender was announced by Emperor Hirohito, all of them laid down their arms. They were sobbing and crying, but they just laid down their arms. And when the American forces came in, they came in fully prepared. There's a section in the book where he says they come fully prepared, B-29 bombers flying overhead, fighters at ready, the combat soldiers at ready, because they were expecting such a fighting force, such a, willing to kill themselves. What are they going to do when the Americans come in? No, they just, children were kept in front, waving out, and not a single shot was fired or any attempt. So he said that was the discipline. So his impression of Japan, is so different from what we otherwise used to. Of course, this was in his teenage years. And he always spoke about that, the way that they listened to their emperor and just followed his word, willing to kill themselves. He said if he had given, the emperor had given even one indication, fight till the end, I don't think that, of course, some of them did fall on their swords and, said, we are not going to surrender. But that was voluntary, not at the, request, not at the instruction of the emperor.
Lovely audience, very erudite, listening with such a rapt attention. And Nikhil, my apologies for running too fast with my questions. I think before I request you to read a favorite passage, I would like to know, I think audience would like to know, what were Ramesh's views in India as an ex-freedom fighter?
Yeah. In fact, my father had a difficult time because he came back in 1946. He came back, of course, as a POW. The book gives the ups and downs, like he was living a life of luxury at the hospitality of the US Army. And then a comedy of errors, and he gets, picked up by the British. They make him a POW. Initially, they welcome him thinking he's a POW of the Japanese, till they later, they fill out a form and it says, no, they're part of the Indian National Army. So he came back into India as a prisoner of war, treated pretty badly by the Brits, and in solitary confinement for 6 days, 28 days in Hong Kong prison as teenagers. And eventually, of course, they are freed after the famous Red Fort trial, fought by Jawaharlal Nehru. And INA is not considered, at least formally, not a traitorous anti-British Empire. It was that, but they were a freedom struggle. But when he was always keen to be a pilot, he was always keen to be in the Indian Air Force after coming to India. So, of course, he came in 1946. He couldn't do much. It was still under the Brits. October of 1947, he applies for the Indian Air Force. Goes through all the tests. Everything is through, provisionally selected. And he's all set to go to Coimbatore for the training. And he gets a letter, as he said, a curt, rather rude letter, saying that, sorry, we found that you're associated.
This is the part which made me ask this question.
Yeah.
Please tell.
You're associated with the Indian National Army, so your candidacy cannot be entertained. And he was severely disappointed, but then he said, I've been through so many ups and downs. If you read the book, you'll, surviving virtually death and then coming out. So he said, okay, I took it in his stride, and he took it in my stride. And then I think there were some, Kamaraj Nadar, and there were other, well-known personalities who helped, the Congress, Indian National Congress. They helped in kind of rehabilitating them. And he was asked to go and meet Meenu Masani and the Tata's group, and he joined Air India as a ground engineer. But he was always keen to be a pilot, so he joined a flying club after he finished this course of 3 years. Till then, this was 1947, 1948, 1949. So as far as he was concerned, there was no independence because he was not called. He was considered a Japanese collaborator and a traitor to the British Empire. 1950, October, India has already become a republic. The Indian Air Force comes searching for pilots because they had a shortage, and they came to flying clubs, where he was in Bihar Flying Club, Patna Flying Club. And he gets, why don't you go and join the Air Force? He was so keen. So he said, I'm not, I had this very bad experience. He said, no, now things have changed. So he goes and meets, that particular officer who encourages him, you apply. So he applies. He clears the test pretty easily because he said that, he had all that experience. And then comes the final, interview. He calls that gentleman, he's a South Indian name, but as he describes him, he was an Englishman in every aspect except for his name. And that's the final interview. So he, asks him, you're in the INA. So young man, who forced you to join? How did you get forced into joining the INA? So he said it was not forced. It was very voluntary. And I'm very proud that I was part of this. So he had a friend who had also in that thing, and he says he kicked him under the table and said, you're going to again get rejected. So that gentleman says, that senior Air Force officer who's interviewing him, says, if we had come across you in Imphal, that's where the Indian National Army confronted the British Indian Army, I would have shot at you. So he said, sir, I would have done likewise, shot back at you. Okay. So, but yet, he says, of course, it was to that gentleman's credit that he didn't take it personally. But he was just amazed. I mean, we used to talk about that. So many years later, there was a pride in people who had actually propped up the British Empire. Yeah, so, and to the degree that they even asked such questions. So, yeah, anyway, so that was his view right through.
Very, very relevant subjects to talk today on 28th of January, 2 days after we celebrated 75th Republic Day. And in this can I request you to read a passage from your book before I give the audience the freedom to ask questions?
So what I'll read is, it's really the human interest part of it. This is the context. This is from when, the Japanese had come in, all of a sudden. They had entered into, this was 23rd of January, 1941. When they came in, the British army started retreating, literally burning bridges. So much so that, even the governor of Burma, the British governor, he was not able to, cross, all those bridges. So anyway, so I'll read from there. That's the context. I'll call my dad Young Ramesh. Young Ramesh and his group are really trying to get out of, get back to India because the Japanese are advancing. So the initial thing was that let's get his mother, and there was a family retainer who was elderly and over 80 at that time. His mother would have been late 40s or early 50s. But then she'll not be able to make the trek because they had all planned to make a trek across, Chittagong, Cox's Bazar, and then walk back. A very arduous trek, so they may not be able to do that. So let's try and get them to catch an aeroplane.
Getting at my favorite passage.
Yeah. So they reached this place called Mingyan in Burma. And they had heard that, there are aeroplanes ferrying elderly, sickly, disabled people, children. So I'll just read from here. The last aircraft of the day. We later came to know that it was the last aircraft to land or take off from Magui. Came in at around 2 in the afternoon. The pilot had already done a round trip in the morning, and this was his second. The British authorities commandeered this aircraft on priority, and the pilot was told that he would have to airlift the governor and his group, and no other refugees would be accommodated on this flight. As it turned out, my grandmom and the family member was also there, waiting to hopefully get a flight back. And then no refugees were to be accommodated. We heard that the pilot resented the order, but waited patiently for the governor to arrive. At 3 o'clock, the governor had failed to show up. The pilot took advantage of this confusion prevailing at the airfield and asked the refugee passengers to board the aircraft quickly. Before the authorities could understand what was happening, he had already lined up and started his run for the takeoff. The governor arrived an hour later, but there was no aircraft to take him, as he and his party had to head further north, and we later heard that he was eventually airlifted from Yitkina, a long way off from Magui. The pilot must have faced the anger of the superiors for leaving a very important person stranded on his way, in this way. I admired his guts. He had saved so many of his own people. The governor could always have made alternative arrangements, but the civilian refugees could not have. But do you know who the pilot was? He was none other than Biju Patnaik, who later became the chief minister of Orissa and then a union minister. This dynamic man made a name for himself in Indonesia as well by helping President Sukarno when he was in trouble, for which the Indonesian government conferred on him their highest honor. So this is one passage. Maybe just a short one more, which you...
Wasn't this magnificent? We know so little about people. Did we know about Mr. Biju Patnaik?
Right. So this is, the Japanese now have overtaken, Rangoon, and they are actually in this place called Mingyan, where they were trying to escape. My grandmother, that's Ramesh's mother, had already safely been flown by Biju Patnaik back to India. So right now, the Japanese are all around, in their typical World War II uniforms. And so at around 8 in the morning, we walked out into the streets. We had hardly reached the corner when we heard guttural shouts from the Japanese soldiers stationed there. The shouts were addressed at us, and one of the soldiers came menacingly towards my uncle, prodded him with his rifle, and started pushing him. I think just to give a context, my father's uncle was, a pretty big shot there. Like he was a general manager of Consolidated Tin Mines and a businessman. And he looked very European. And at that time, what had happened was the British army and, of course, Britishers there, knowing that they didn't want to come under, become a prisoner of war, prisoner under the Japanese advancing forces, they had discarded the uniforms and, so many of the locals started wearing those uniforms and saying they are from the Burmese Defense Army and so on. So in this case, my dad's uncle used to wear, that solar topi and khakis and puttees and, typically what the Brits used to wear. So that's how he probably was dressed, right? So as I mentioned earlier, my uncle could easily be mistaken for an Englishman with his ruddy complexion. But what compounded the resemblance was a tie. Okay, it's covered here. It was typically that of an Englishman, what an Englishman wore in Burma and Malay: baggy khaki shorts, a short-sleeved shirt tucked in, light brown stockings held in place by garters, brown leather shoes, and finally a solar topi. His remonstrating with the soldiers in impeccable English did not help matters at the least. Luckily for us, one of the soldiers, probably a little more educated and traveled than the others, asks my uncle if he was an Englishman. The phrase he used was "Ingrisu ka" being the word denoting a question in Japanese. At first, my uncle's vehement denial went unheeded, and his declaration that he was an Indian was not believed. Then the soldier must have had a brainwave and asked "Ganji ka," apparently referring to Mahatma Gandhi, which was an identity, I guess, in their eyes. With change in their attitude, and broad smiles broke out. But the first soldier who had threatened us with his rifle was still suspicious. So this is really, just a short passage.
Yes, majestic. Ganji ka, Gandhi kya? You are Gandhi. Yes, Gandhi meant Indian, majestic. And I'll stop it here to leave the floor to the wonderful audience. You are free to ask your question. Welcome to ask your questions. Yes, there is a hand there. Yeah.
Talking about the spy school, is it possible or was it possible for you to find out, firstly, what was the duration, how long did it exist, and also what was its contribution specifically towards India's freedom struggle, or what the INA was doing at that time? Do we have any specifics on that?
Okay, the spy school itself was established in a place in Penang. It's called the Penang Free School. That building still exists. And really the idea was to create a core of agents. And as I told you, 34 men were trained. And they were trained in a variety of skills to be sent to India to spy on British installations, but also to sow unrest in factories and so on, and to foment strikes. So they had two objectives. One was civil unrest, and the other one was military. Now, as I told you, the agents were sent to India before they were ready, because the guy who was running the school, his name was Colonel Iwakuro, he was in a hurry. He was kind of a political soldier. And they all got caught because of a double agent who told the British that they were coming. In fact, that double agent, after the war, was awarded the George Cross by the British, which is like the Mahavir Chakra, the #2 award, right? So the school itself failed because of what happened. But the interesting thing is what happened afterwards. Because of the fact that the Japanese had sent these agents without telling the Indians, the entire INA collapsed. And Captain Mohan Singh, who was the founder of that INA, the Japanese put him in jail. And so then another freedom fighter, his name is Raj Bihari Bose, who was in Tokyo. He spoke to the premier of Japan, Tojo, saying, look, the guy whom you want to bring over is Subhash Chandra Bose. And Subhash Bose was in Germany trying to get Hitler to do something like this. By then, he was convinced that Hitler was a bit crazy. He wasn't going to do anything. So Hitler put Bose and another man called Abid Hassan in a submarine, in a U-boat, U-180, sailed all the way down around Africa to a point off the coast of Madagascar. And those two were transferred to a Japanese submarine, I-29, in the middle of a raging storm. And in fact, the captain of the U-boat asked Bose, hey, do you want to go back? And Bose said, I didn't come all this way to go back. So then they put Bose in a Japanese submarine, brought him to Malaya, and the rest is well known. So in a kind of a convoluted way, that school and its collapse had an impact in the fact that Bose was brought over to resurrect the INA and take it to a completely different level. And that building, that Penang Free School, is still there. So if you go to Penang, go visit it.
To what extent did you integrate fiction into the story or the narrative of
Okay.
the story,
Yeah.
which is inspired by your granduncle?
Yeah, okay, very good question. So, as I told you earlier, what I chose to do was to use the kind of storytelling part of my writing as a way to convey the history. So, the book is really what I would call faction, in that it is almost all factual. But, like for example, that passage that I read for you, that's fictional. I've dramatized it, and as a way to actually tell the story. In the back of the book, there's a section called Author's Notes, where I have clearly told you where I have departed from the actual facts and why, and one or two characters that I've introduced, which were fictional, I've told you who they were. So it's really I've used fiction as a way to convey actual facts.
What's your name? Tanushree, he has given notes, appendices in the end of the book. And they are very useful. Names of the places which have changed, the difficult words, and where he has used his imagination, and where he has picked up facts directly. There is a famous quote by Albert Camus. I like this line and repeat it often. Fiction is truth. Fiction is truth told in the form of a lie. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you so much for being a wonderful audience. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. It was a brilliant and a very enlightening session. I'd like to call on our VLF patron, Advocate Anand Jaiswal, sir, to please present these mementos to the two authors.
Can I interrupt for a second? I think books are kept outside. Their books in the bookstall. So you can buy books and get them signed by the author.